Hello again, everyone. Please excuse my voice. I'm still getting over that illness that I told you about in my email and announcement. And please excuse me if I have to cough in the middle of this lecture. Hopefully, I won't have to, but you never know. And if you hear a screeching little child, that's my baby downstairs. So hopefully you won't, but if you do, that's what it is. She's having fun playing downstairs with her daddy. All right. I just wanted to begin this lecture with going over what you're supposed to be doing in the paper. If you're feeling a little bit lost with close reading, please don't feel alone. It's a hard concept to wrap your brain around, and there's a reason why you're doing it first. The reason that you're doing what's called a close reading, and I hopefully will be able to explain it in more detail when you're hearing me explain it rather than just reading an explanation of it. The reason that you're doing it first is because, first of all, it lends itself very well to poetry. Poetry, by its very nature, has a lot of depth. And so there's lots of layers of meaning and lots of layers of meaning that you can create through your analysis of poems. While that's also true of stories and of drama, it's a little bit less complicated because in poetry we're using language in a different way than we traditionally use it, just speaking to each other or just writing in prose. Poetry is kind of its own animal, and so close reading really does lend itself very well to analysis of poetry. So sort of the generic reason or the genre reason that we do close reading first is because we're doing poetry first. But also, close reading helps sort of dive you in to thinking differently about language and thinking differently about the way things are put together. A lot of times we sort of just take for granted the way something is structured, the way something is presented to us, the words that someone has chosen. We just read them and sort of take them for granted and don't really think very deeply about what they themselves mean. But with close reading, you look at everything in a little bit of a different light. You look at it in a way that is richer and deeper, and you're looking for meaning where maybe you wouldn't have seen it before. Some people get highly annoyed by this. They think there isn't that much meaning in a poem, and you can have that opinion if you'd like, but for our purposes, you are creating an argument about how the construction of the poem creates its message. Okay? So the main goal that you have, the goal of your paper should be answering the question, how does whatever element of the poem or elements of the poem that you want to talk about, and we're going to talk about what some of those might be, create a message, and what is that message? So if we're talking about the fundamentals of writing, then if that's the main question that your paper should answer, then that's what your thesis statement should state, okay? So as we go along here and we're talking about close reading, I want you to be thinking about how does this help me create my paper, okay? For week 3, I've asked you to create in your short response kind of a practice run of a close reading. It doesn't have to be on the poem that you choose to do your paper on. I don't know why you wouldn't try to get some feedback on your ideas for the poem that you want to do for your first paper, especially since your short response and your topic proposal are due in the same week. But that's entirely up to you. There's no requirement that you focus on the same poem in short response 1 that you do in paper 1. But in short response 1, I'm just asking you to kind of do a trial run. It's a shorter version. It's, 250 words. It's an opportunity for you to kind of create a little mini argument about how some formal element of the poem creates a particular meaning. I'll be able to tell you if you're on the right track. If you're doing what a close reading should do, then you should be answering that question. How does this element create this meaning? And then you're going to show us in the body of your argument. All right, so close reading focuses on different elements that you might find in a poem. Certainly not all of these elements are going to be present in every poem. And so when I give you kind of a laundry list of things to consider, it's not a requirement that you discuss all of those things. And a lot of students end up a bit confused about this, thinking that they have to kind of answer questions in their paper, that they have to address all of these elements that I talk about in this assignment sheet and also in the handout that I gave you. No. You're going to choose the things that best fit your particular poem. So here you might construct an argument that focuses on particular symbols that are present in your poem. If you feel like your poem is full of symbolism and you want to use that as a way of talking about how the symbols that the author constructs and uses help to construct and communicate a particular message, great. You can focus on that and then talk about multiple symbols and what they do and show us what those symbols are and give us a sense of what those symbols do for us. If you have a lot of alliteration, a lot of play with words, then you might focus on that. What does that alliteration do? How does it feel to the reader? How does it create a particular meaning? Okay, so you want to choose the ones that best support your argument, that best show how the author is trying to create a meaning. So the first thing you really have to do anytime you're doing a close reading is you have to read the poem, right? Obviously. But with close reading, what you have to do is a little bit more than just reading. You have to read several times. I want to kind of show you something that I found that I think might help if you're still struggling. This is the Purdue Online Writing Lab. Fabulous resource if you have any questions about grammatical or stylistic issues that maybe we're not addressing. Since this is 1102, we don't tackle kind of grammatical stuff. I'm assuming that you got that in 1101. But this can really help you sort of refresh your memory on any of those issues. But it also has good stuff about writing and literature. So it's definitely a great resource. I really like it. But this is talking about close reading. It kind of takes you through a mini close reading about how you might look at a particular poem. So it's certainly something to look at. But what I wanted to show you is something that they say. There's a little slideshow down here. One thing that they say that I really liked is that you have to approach the poem in a different way. And a lot of people just read through a poem, try to understand the gist of it, or just give up, and then move on. When you're doing a close reading, you have to read and reread, and as you're rereading, mark it up. If you don't want to mark up your book, then type it out in the same form that it appears, because remember that form is important, and mark it up online. Mark it up in a digital copy. That's fine. But you have to be able to annotate certain things. You have to be able to circle or highlight something that strikes you. You have to be able to identify, ooh, that's alliteration. Ooh, wait, that's a symbol. Oh, I think that might be some kind of, okay, what's that rhyme scheme going on there? You have to dissect the poem, okay? It's not about just reading it and kind of getting the gist of it and then writing about it. It doesn't work like that. Close reading is all about diving into it and really, really, really immersing yourself in the language. If you don't do that, you're not going to be able to see the patterns. You're not going to be able to see what the author is doing with language, and that's the whole goal of a close reading, okay? So read the poem slowly, read it twice at least. When I do a close reading, I think I read the thing 5, 8, 10 times. And each time after the first and second time, I'm looking for more things. So I might have the basic idea of what I want to talk about in that third time, but then I'm looking maybe for more evidence of a point. Or I'm looking for, hey, there's alliteration there. Is there alliteration other places? So I'm not always just reading it for content. The third and through the 25th time, or however many times I'm reading it for evidence. I'm reading to look and dissect the language and look just for the things that I'm looking for. So I might be looking for alliteration, or I might be looking for like loaded words that kind of jump out at me, or words that are unusual, or something like that. Reading it aloud can also be really helpful, just because a lot of poems were meant to be read aloud. They aren't meant to just live on the page. They're meant to live in out loud and in verse and orally. So you need to think about how it's going to change as you're reading it out loud. And again, mark it up. Mark it up, mark it up, mark it up. Even with questions that you have, like, what does this mean? Or why is this here? Or, a big question mark next to a word, like, what does that mean? Sometimes those words can really be the key to something that you end up seeing. That word that you had to look up, maybe that's, a really important word. Maybe that's the key to the message that the author is sending. If you're not paying attention to that, you're not going to get everything that you need to get out of the poem. All right, so let's go to the the close reading handout that I asked you to read in week 1, I would encourage you to read it again, even pull it up right now if you are able, so that we can go over it together. All right, this just gives you some tips. I know that there are some allusions to UF in here. That's because I teach at UF as well. I'm sorry for not changing that, but it doesn't really matter. The main ideas here are the same. So the first thing that you need to understand about the poem is what it's trying to say. And sometimes there's a logical message. Sometimes it's clear that the author is trying to actually say something, maybe about a person or maybe about a thing. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes it's kind of just stream of consciousness thought. Regardless, you want to have some kind of idea of what the literal meaning of the passage or poem is. Because if you're misunderstanding that, you can be assuming that the author is saying one thing and end up constructing an argument about that and be entirely wrong. And while, yes, there is room for personal opinion in literature, just because it's your opinion doesn't make it right. You have to have evidence to support that. And that's true of any kind of stand you take on any literature. You can think it says one thing, but if your thoughts are based on misunderstanding of what the actual text says, then that's a problem. So you need to make sure that you are looking up words you don't understand and think about what it's actually literally meaning. All right, so then think about if maybe that passage sort of fits into something else. Does it sort of fit with other poems that poet has written? Does it fit inside of a literary movement? It's entirely possible you won't know that, and that's fine. But if it seems to make connections with other things that you've read or other things that that you have heard about, that might be something to note somewhere. All right, so when I think when you're thinking about how the poem progresses, you want to think about each passage, and this is going to be true of short stories and dramas as well as just poems, but we're talking about poems now. When you're talking about a poem and the way that it flows, you want to look to see if there's huge gaps. So as you're sort of paraphrasing what's happening, are there big gaps in between ideas? So, for example, if someone is talking about the beauty of something and then automatically jumps to the death of something, that to me seems like a pretty large gap. You know, there's no like segue there. And if there's not a segue there, then you want to ask yourself, why not? So when you're thinking about the logic of something, is there something that's being assumed that we know? And if there's a big gap, you can guess, okay, we're either assuming something here that someone already knows, or we have a big gap for a reason. Like we're meaning to call attention to this gap. We want you to feel jarred in some way between beauty and death. Goodness, there's a lot that comes in between that. So what does that suggest about maybe what the meaning is? When you find big gaps, or when you find these kind of jarring disjunctions between things that seem like, well, those don't really go together, or, well, first the person's talking about this, and then they're talking about this, and I don't know how those things go together. That can be really, really instructive about what the poet is trying to say.